What if the one person you thought you could trust more than anyone in the world suddenly crossed a line, making you question everything? At 62, I never imagined my life would take a turn like this. After retiring from my teaching career, I settled into a peaceful life, spending my days gardening and reading books. My husband had passed away 5 years ago, and since then, I had found comfort in the rhythm of a quiet routine. But then, everything changed when my stepson, Alex, came to stay with me. Alex was 22, fresh out of college, and struggling to get his career off the ground. I had always seen him as a quiet, young man, and we didn't have much of a connection until he called me that day. "Hi, Marla." His voice was soft, and I could sense hesitation. "I know this is sudden, but I need a favor." It didn't take long for me to realize he was trying to make a career in a city full of competition. He was having trouble paying rent, and before he could say anything else, I told him he could stay with me for as long as he needed. Little did I know, opening my door to him would change everything. I remember the day he arrived. I spent the morning cleaning the guest room, trying to make everything perfect. But as the hours went by, I started to feel anxious. It had been so long since I had shared my space with anyone, especially a young man. When Alex finally pulled up in his beat-up car, I couldn't help but notice how much he had changed. Gone was the awkward teenager I had once known. He was now a confident, tall young man with broad shoulders. He greeted me with that same familiar smile, but there was something different in his eyes. "Hello, Marla," he said, pulling me into a brief hug. I smiled back, a little unsure of how to act. "I hope the trip wasn't too tough." "It wasn't bad. Thanks for letting me stay here." The first few days went by without incident. Alex stayed mostly in his room or was out looking for work, and I did my best to stay out of his way. I didn't want to be the overbearing stepmother, but there was something that shifted in the house with him there. He smiled at me more, lingered in the kitchen after dinner, chatting about his day. It was nice having someone else around again, someone who wasn't just a distant memory. In the days that followed, everything between Alex and I felt different. The air around us was thick with unsaid words, and every glance, every touch, felt more charged than before. It was as if the world had shifted on its axis, and we were now orbiting in a strange new dimension where our feelings, once buried deep beneath layers of confusion and fear, now stood in the open. It wasn't just the kiss that had changed things, it was everything that had come after it. We still talked about work, the weather, our favorite TV shows, but there was an underlying tension beneath it all, a current that neither of us could ignore. I found myself second-guessing every interaction. Was I reading too much into things? Was he? Or had the boundaries we had carefully drawn up between us completely disintegrated in that one reckless moment? For the first few days, we kept our distance, at least physically. We both pretended that things were the same, like nothing had changed. But it was clear to both of us that we were walking on eggshells. The conversations had taken on a new tone, almost as if we were both waiting for the other to make the first move, to acknowledge the elephant in the room. Alex was quieter than usual, his usual carefree attitude replaced with a quiet contemplation. It was as if he was constantly thinking, overthinking, trying to make sense of everything that had transpired between us. I noticed his eyes would linger on me a little longer than before, like he was trying to decode something that was hidden behind my words. And when we spoke, there was an intensity to his voice, as if he was trying to measure the weight of every sentence. I tried to keep things light, to avoid saying anything that might stir up the chaos I felt inside, but it wasn't easy. The more I thought about it, the more complicated it seemed. Our dynamic, once so easy and carefree, was now fraught with questions we hadn't even begun to ask ourselves. What did this mean for us? Was this just a one-time thing, a moment of weakness that we'd both regret? Or was this the start of something real? Something that would require us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about each other? And more importantly, what about the boundaries we had set? The ones that we both knew were never supposed to be crossed. For the first time in weeks, I found myself sitting in my room at night, lying awake long after Alex had gone to bed, replaying everything in my head. The kiss had been intoxicating, yes, but it also left a trail of questions in its wake. I didn't know what we were anymore. We weren't just coworkers, but we weren't anything else either, at least not yet. One evening, after a particularly long and awkward dinner, we found ourselves standing in the kitchen, the last of the dishes drying in the sink. I had tried to push away the tension that had been hanging over us all night, but it was impossible to ignore. I could feel the weight of his presence in the small space between us. The room seemed to shrink with every second that passed, and neither of us knew how to break the silence. Finally, Alex spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about us," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. I turned to him, my heart jumping in my chest. I hadn't expected him to be the one to bring it up. "Us?" I repeated, my voice betraying a hint of nervousness. He nodded, his hand resting on the counter, fingers tapping lightly. "Yeah, I know it's complicated, but I can't stop thinking about you. I don't know what this is, but I can't just pretend like nothing happened. I don't want to." I took a deep breath, my mind racing. The words I wanted to say were stuck in my throat, tangled with the emotions I couldn't sort through. "I don't know what to say, Alex," I admitted, my voice soft. "I didn't expect any of this. I didn't think I'd feel this way." His gaze softened as he stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed to know if you felt the same." The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard. I had never heard him sound so unsure, so uncertain. Alex, the man who seemed so confident and in control, now looked fragile, like he was waiting for something to shatter. I realized, in that moment, that this wasn't just about the kiss. This was about something deeper, a connection that neither of us had expected, but that we both felt. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "Everything feels too messy." "I know," he responded softly, his hand reaching out to touch mine, fingers brushing against my skin. "But sometimes messes are the only things that are real." I felt a surge of warmth in my chest as his words sank in. It was true, wasn't it? Life was messy. Our feelings were messy. But maybe that's what made them real. The uncertainty, the fear, the thrill of the unknown. It was all part of the process. And maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk. We stood there for a moment, our fingers entwined, neither of us knowing what would happen next. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the mess. I wasn't afraid of where this could go. I realized that, despite all the complications, this felt right in a way I couldn't explain. Maybe we didn't have all the answers. Maybe we didn't even know where this would lead. But for once, it didn't matter. "Maybe we just take it one day at a time," I said, finally breaking the silence. "See where it goes." Alex nodded, his smile returning, but it wasn't the carefree grin I had seen so often. It was softer, more real. "One day at a time," he echoed, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. As the night went on, the tension between us slowly began to dissolve. There were still 1,000 questions left unanswered. Still 1,000 ways this could go wrong. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. We didn't have to have it all figured out. We didn't have to have all the answers. What mattered was that we were willing to face the uncertainty together. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. It was a few weeks later, after Alex had finally secured his job. We had been living in this strange new dynamic for some time now, a constant tug of war between the growing connection we shared and the boundaries we were both too afraid to cross. Despite our unspoken agreement to tread lightly, it was becoming harder to ignore the undeniable tension that simmered between us. That night, we had decided to celebrate Alex's success. We ordered takeout from the local Italian restaurant he loved, opened a bottle of wine, and sat down in the living room, chatting about his future. He seemed so different now, more confident, more grounded. His excitement was contagious, and for a moment, I felt as if we had gone back to the easy days of simply sharing a space, without all the complications that had surfaced between us. But as the evening went on, the atmosphere shifted. There was a softness in the way he looked at me, a familiarity that had once been absent. I felt a growing warmth in my chest, and the wine, while making my words a little more loose, made the distance between us feel even smaller. We were sitting closer than usual, our legs brushing against each other as we exchanged stories and jokes. But this time, it wasn't just the wine talking. It wasn't just the celebration of his new job. No, it was something deeper. The air between us felt charged, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Every glance lingered longer than usual. Every touch felt intentional. I tried to push the thought away, to deny the growing pull I felt, but my mind couldn't ignore the way my heart beat faster whenever he spoke, or the way I instinctively leaned in when he laughed. It all came to a head when the conversation turned to that night in the kitchen. The night everything had changed between us. Alex hesitated, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. I couldn't stop thinking about it, he said quietly, his eyes locked onto mine, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a confession. That kiss. I keep replaying it in my head, and I know it's complicated, but I don't regret it. I just want to be with you. In that moment, my heart skipped a beat and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I wanted to say something, anything, to stop this madness from escalating, to remind us of the boundaries we had set, but there was something in the way his voice cracked when he spoke, something raw and honest, that made it impossible to turn away. Before I could process my thoughts, he reached out. His hand was trembling slightly as he took mine, his thumb gently brushing over my skin. The simple touch sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I realized that my resistance was crumbling. I had never imagined that I'd be standing on the edge of something so complicated, so entirely against the rules. Yet here we were, caught between desire and guilt. I swallowed hard, the knot in my chest tightening. "Alex," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But I didn't know how to finish the sentence. How could I? Everything I wanted to say felt irrelevant in that moment, like the rules we had set for ourselves no longer mattered. He leaned in closer, his face just inches from mine. The scent of his cologne was intoxicating, and I felt my body lean toward him without even realizing it. "I know this is complicated," he murmured, his voice low and sincere, "but I don't care. I just want to be with you." His words sent a rush of warmth through me, a mixture of longing and fear. I felt my heart race in my chest, my pulse quickening as the space between us vanished completely. I couldn't think anymore. I couldn't deny how I felt. In that moment, nothing else mattered. "I want to," I finally admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I want to be with you too." It was as if a dam had broken. I could see the relief in his eyes, the hesitation that had been there for so long, finally fading away. Without another word, he closed the distance between us, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was filled with all the emotions we had both been holding back for weeks. There was no hesitation this time. There was no pulling away. It was everything we had been afraid to admit, everything we had tried to bury, coming to the surface in one single breathtaking moment. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if we were both still processing the enormity of what we were doing. But then, as if a switch had been flipped, the kiss deepened. More urgent, more desperate. It was everything I had been longing for, but it was also everything I had feared. The room felt smaller, the world outside ceased to exist. All that mattered was the feeling of his hands on me, the warmth of his body pressing against mine, and the overwhelming need to pull him closer. When we finally pulled apart, both of us gasping for air, I looked into his eyes. There was no turning back now. Whatever had happened between us, whatever this was, had already changed us. But in that moment, I realized that I didn't want to undo it. It felt real. It felt right, despite everything. Alex gave me a small, shaky smile, his hand still resting gently on my waist. "I told you it was complicated," he whispered, his voice rough. I nodded, my heart still racing, the weight of what we had just done settling over me. "Yeah," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "But sometimes life is, isn't it?" We stayed there for a long moment, caught between the thrill of what had just happened and the uncertainty of what it meant for the future. Neither of us knew what would come next, but we both knew one thing. Something had shifted, something had changed, and there was no going back. Life doesn't always go according to plan. Sometimes it throws you into situations you never imagined, with people you never expected to feel this way about. And even though everything between us was complicated, messy, and unexpected, it was real. In that moment, that's all that mattered. If you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications.